Hello and welcome to Hey Not the Face with your host, John Nash, and your producer, me, Steffi Haynes. And today we are going to talk about the class action lawsuit, the antitrust lawsuit. John, what happened?
Well, today is a day that we've been waiting for a long time. And that day is the return of the cat. No, I'm just kidding. The cat did come back today. It's on my lap. So I'm kind of in a position where the audio might not be as good as I'd hope because I can't get close to the mic and I can't get my headphones on because the cat is on my lap. But anyways, today is we finally, after years and years of waiting, I can't even remember when he said that he's got a written opinion. I mean, he's got an opinion on class cert. How long ago that was, but we finally got the written opinion. He's officially granted Judge Boulwares in the Kong Lee versus Zuffa lawsuit, the Lee versus Zuffa antitrust lawsuit that they're trying to make a class action. He's officially granted class certification. In other words, it's no longer a group of fighters, the small group of fighters, 5 fighters suing the UFC. It is now every UFC fighter that fits the definition of a class member of the Bout Class that got certified. They are now automatically enrolled as plaintiffs in the case. They're not named plaintiffs. They're not the ones that are going to have to show up to court, but they're automatically enrolled. So if the plaintiffs win, all the damages, all those fighters are eligible for damages. So that's massive. It's something that I'm going through the whole thing. I don't know why it took this long. I didn't see anything in there that made me think it needed extra work. All the information seems from previous we've had for a while. But we finally have the class has been certified and the case gets to move forward.
All right. You mentioned the different types of classes. And from what I understand, there are 2, identity class and bout class. Please break down the difference in identity class and bout class.
Well, the bout class is those fighters that fought in the UFC or under Zuffa in North America or televised in North America. I believe that's the definition, the definition they had for it, between the dates of December 16, 2010 until June 30th, 2017. So roughly 1,200 fighters fit that definition of fighters that fought in the UFC. They're in the bout class. The accusation is that the UFC used their market power, their monopoly power to suppress the wages of those fighters. So those 1,200 fighters who fought in the UFC at that time are the fights that they had during that time too are eligible for damages as the case go forward. The other class is called the identity class. Those are during the same period. It's a smaller group of fighters, but those are fighters that the UFC used their image in various merchandise, video games, things like that during that same period. But that because of various reasons, one, it was harder to track. There was a smaller group of fighters, harder to track from his different revenue sources, who was getting what. The judge decided that class, the damages are not specific enough across the board, that class is not going to be certified. And so all those fighters are eliminated. There's a lot of crossover between the two groups. But for the named plaintiffs, it eliminates Nathan Corey is one of the named plaintiffs. So now the named plaintiffs are just Kong Lee, John Fitch, Brandon Vera, Javier Vasquez, and Kyle Kingsbury.
Okay. There's something in there that you made note of. You said it on TV. So for those fighters that were fighting in the UFC and maybe they fought in foreign countries and maybe they only had 1 or 2 fights and maybe those 1 or 2 fights were overseas, as long as it was aired in the United States, say a pay-per-view or a fight night or whatever, then that would count, correct?
That's the way it should count. And my understanding is I looked there once and I don't think there's any fights that they had outside the UFC that weren't broadcast in the UFC. So basically anybody that fought for the UFC under a Zuffa promotion at the time, because that includes some of the Strikeforce fights, is eligible for is automatically enrolled as a class member.
Let's talk about contracts and compensation. What should we be aware of regarding contracts and compensation?
Well, this was pretty interesting because he went through a lot of stuff that's no surprise to anybody that listens to this show when we talk about contracts. he went through, how the system they work. You have a show, and you put in quotations, a show amount to participate in the bout, and then a win bonus payment if you win. All the different tools in the UFC contract. But he talked about something that's not brought up a lot, and one is that the fighters have no control over their careers in the contract. The UFC dictates terms all the time, right? So that's a big part of the problem, the power. They pointed out that the UFC Zuffa utilized a tiered system of payments, right? So for independent contractors and stuff, this was a good evidence that the UFC basically could dictate the price because they knew what every guy would get paid based on where they are on the scale. They talked about how the fighters are not, employees; they're independent contractors. Because of that, they have to pay for their own training, all their own stuff. And because that also their careers are short, they're more dependent on the UFC. So it was interesting that they brought up a lot of the stuff we talk about that you don't hear other people talk about much, about basically the status of how important a matchmaker is and stuff. The other thing they pointed out is, again, something we talk about on the show is the fighters typically sign contracts with Zuffa either for a minimum period of time or for a specific number of bouts. Important and pursuant to the contracts, the timing of bouts and matching of opponents was determined unilaterally by Zuffa, right? Consequently, this means that the PAR agreement, promotional agreement, generally do not guarantee, for instance, a minimum number of fights per year,
Right.
and hence do not guarantee a minimum salary for each fighter. And so the whole thing about 3 fights a year, we have to guarantee, the courts are pointing out that is not the truth. There's no guarantee of how many fights you have to get. And that means you fighters have no idea what they're going to make per year going in. So all that kind of interesting, and it kind of shows how much little leverage the fighters have in this situation.
You had predicted that this would happen in August, only 3 years back when, the judge was like right on the cusp of giving his written piece. And it took him 3 years, but you still got the month right.
I got the month right.
I got
the month right. It's a good thing I didn't say what year it was at the time, because I can now lay claim that I got it right as Ginger Snapped the Twitter handle wrong. But she pointed out I said August. And I did not say the year, even though the implication at the time was probably 2020 or 2021.
And you were speaking of Snarky Ginger. She's an awesome person.
I apologize for that. I talk with her, interact with her on Twitter a lot, but it's hard to remember bizarre Twitter handle names.
She's a good chick. I want to ask you a question that might be a little off key here, but it's important to get it out there and to find out if there's some way that this antitrust suit can provide some kind of solution to what happened in Utah just this past week or past 2 weeks, where that there's a confidentiality agreement that fighters enter into, or they can decline, because 4 fighters did decline, but to guard how much they are paid. And they cited trade secrets and things like that for the UFC, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it was clearly a whole big line of bullshit. But I'm wondering, since we're speaking about contracts and compensation, if this turns out the way that the fighters want it, if the plaintiffs are successful, is there in any way that could be impacted, or is that just completely something that the UFC is working out with the commissions?
Yeah, that has nothing to do with the case per se, but there is a chance, because the idea of the case is to weaken the UFC.
Yes, that's where I was going.
I should point out, not weaken like the promotion and the revenue, because the whole idea is to give the fighters more power so they can get more revenue, but that the UFC does not have the ability to do what we call regulatory capture, which is they're doing, because the UFC has all the fighters, all the money. The commissions, if they want any sort of MMA or combat sports event in their state that generates any money, they've got to cater to what the UFC says. So the point, I guess, the suit would be like, we want to have it that multiple promotions are out there, that you are not beholden to just the UFC. The UFC cannot say jump and you say how high in the future. That's a possible what they're shooting for, but I don't know if that'll happen in the case. But at the same time, the stuff like that with the athletic commissions, this case has no bearing on it.
So this case, no matter how it shook out, couldn't possibly help help that situation at all.
Yeah, not only in an indirect way if at the end
Yeah,
result
that's what
is
I
that
mean. And that's what I'm saying. In some indirect fashion, could it somehow like a trickle down effect of the truth? You know what I mean?
well, I mean, and like again, like as I described, the indirect method would be like the UFC no longer has such power over the market that they can, because basically it's the UFC. We know it's the UFC telling these commissions not to report this stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
The only way if this case would affect it, if it goes all the way through the end, the fighters win, the UFC is no longer as powerful in the space that they can dictate to the commissions to do that, then indirectly, because of this case, then athletic commissions might decide to start revealing pay again. But it would not be the result of the case per se.
Okay. Would it be fair to say, like, if the Ali Act was enabled for MMA, would that somehow?
That might more, because in some states they reveal boxing purses and stuff and cite the Ali Act implications that the Ali Act dictates that they're supposed to. Now, some states say it doesn't, but some states, because that they do it, and also because the General Accounting Office has a specific report that says disclosure is what the purpose of the Ali Act is, and we need more disclosure to help fighters. And so that's a tool that some you can wave in commissions' faces to get them to go along to release boxing purses more often. But no, again, it's not unless there's an enforcement mechanism that's enhanced, something with the Ali Act, the commissions generally are kind of ignoring the Ali Act at times.
Okay. So we talked about compensation and contracts and even indirect relations to that. Let's talk about Zuffa's dominance in the market and how the judge viewed it.
Yeah, well, they basically dictated how the UFC has a market share of approximately 90% of the revenue since 2008. Which is de facto market power. So when people say, I'm not going to say monopoly anymore because people get confused by that. They'll look up Webster's dictionary and say, oh, they're not a monopoly because it says you need one buyer. You're like, well, the court system doesn't quite work that way. We refer to things as monopolies that aren't the only buyer or only a seller, I should say. A monopoly is only the one buyer. But if I say market power means you control the industry, you control how prices are set, right? UFC has 90% of the revenue. That's like almost twice the necessary amount you need for the basically to go, yep, that's someone with market power. That has monopoly and monopsony power. So they blow past. In fact, for almost the entire period they studied the class, the big three rivals of the UFC, Strikeforce, Bellator, and World Series of Fighting, never once combined for more than 9% of the revenues.
Wow.
So altogether, their best year, they had 1/10 what the UFC was bringing in. Now, what's interesting is the judge is pretty clear. It's a pretty harsh opinion he wrote here, this written opinion, because he goes after stuff like he talks about the nebulous factors and predatory of the UFC. But one of them I thought was very interesting. He talks about how the stuff like the promoter's acumen or the special sauce promotions basically is unsupported. In other words, the UFC's position is not because they're just amazing promoters, that they don't have some special secret, that they don't know what they're doing so much better. So he knocks that down. He says they have market power. They dominated the market because of their actions. That's not to say they're going to win the case automatically, going forward, because there's math involved in this case. There's things called regressions, and you gotta prove like how we came to these conclusions, or how do we determine how much the fighter should have got. But things of like how the UFC acted to take over the markets. One comment quote he had is, these findings, which the court credits, demonstrates defendants' dominance in the input and output market. It further establishes how Zuffa's dominance in the output market, the selling, right, enhanced its ability to suppress compensation in the input market. Now the court has found that the plaintiffs have established defendants' dominance in the market. The court moves on to analyze evidence of competitors' natural and artificial barriers to entry. In other words, it right there they state outright that basically the UFC has dominated the market, monopoly. It's a foregone conclusion that they have market power. The question now is we have to look at is what barriers of entry have they put in place to make sure they retain that and make it harder for competitors to spring up.
I like one of the things that he said, and I quote, unfettered power to suppress pay.
Yes, yes. I mean, again, he has a lot of this stuff. Basically, there are some harsh comments in this. I should, that's a little strong, probably not hard, but very strong comments basically about how the UFC's power is blatantly operating this way, blatantly doing stuff that would be viewed as a violation of the Sherman Act or some other contractual law and stuff that you're not expected to behave like this, and especially when you have this kind of market power. Now the question going forward, and again, will be when we get to the math parts. But he again and again he was pretty blatant about that he found the evidence overwhelming by the plaintiffs that the UFC's actions were anti-competitive.
Tell me about barriers to entry, specifically regarding talent.
Yes. The three main barriers of evidence entry he cites are for competitors are coercive contracts that restrict the overall supply of fighters, right? Lack of cross promotion and dominance in the headliner market. So the barriers of entry to break it down, is the coercive contracts is you cannot get access to these fighters, right? Because they're all signed to exclusive contracts with the UFC that those fighters can't get out of. The lack of co-promotion is, let's say you have a great fighter, right? And you want to put on a big fight and build up your fighter and make revenue. The UFC will never co-promote. So your fighter has no access, again, to these top fighters that can make him a bigger fighter. And finally, their dominance in what's called the headliner market. All the top fighters are signed with the UFC. So even if you're building a fighter that has the potential to be a massive star, all the headliners are signed. All the other fighters that be put against to make that guy a star or a bigger star are with the UFC, preventing you from building up your competing promotion.
Tell me about anti-competitive behavior to maintain that monopsony.
There's just an endless amount of anti-competitive behavior. If we go through, some of the anti-competitive behavior is they bought out their rivals, right? What's interesting, he points out they bought out these rivals and they made claims that we went to get them the fighters, but he really buys into the argument that their purchase of these rivals, there was no justification on the basis of competitive reasons. In other words, they didn't buy them because it gave them stronger competition. It built up the MMA sphere in some way it made MMA better. They bought them up to take these fighters or these promotions off the landscape so that the fighters themselves couldn't use them to push up their wages, and also that way that those promotions could never build themselves into a potential rival or than the UFC. So it's again kind of a damning statement. They go through many of the reasons how they used anti-competitive conduct. Again, mostly through exclusory contracts, which kept the fighters locked up. They also did it through extra contractual methods, make fighters' contracts effectively perpetual. So they did all these things so the fighter couldn't leave the contract, he couldn't get out. We've talked about this again and again on the show, the way how they do that, tolling provisions or offering them fights they don't want, stuff like that. And third and final, we brought up for the acquisition and shutting down of rivals. So you put those three together, contracts that are basically locked up fighters are under contract, and then you use extra contractual methods to make sure the fighters are basically perpetual, can't get out of those contracts, and then you acquire the rival promotions. That's going to give you a lot of power over the sphere. And I think this is the part people miss. That is the behavior that they're arguing is a violation of the Sherman Act. You can have a monopoly. There's nothing illegal in a monopoly power, I should say. You can have monopoly power, because I don't want to confuse people that pick up the Webster's Dictionary and go after us again. You can have market power, monopoly or monopsony power. It's not illegal if you acquire it in a certain way. What is illegal is intentionally going out of your way to acquire it, right? What is illegal is intentionally trying to retain it by doing methods to retain that market power and abusing it. And as we go through this whole thing, they go again and again and again how the UFC basically violated all three of those, that they intentionally did stuff like make contracts specifically a way to make sure that they would retain the fighters and get market power, and bought out rival promotions for that intent, that they intentionally attempted to retain it by, again, going after rival promotions to make sure they got put out of business or acquired, or making sure that fighters couldn't go anywhere else to potentially create rival promotions. And third, they abused it by using techniques that we described before. It's an abuse of your market power to have all that money and leverage and basically dictate terms to fighters that way, using all that. All three of those are a violation. And again, they go through that, how the UFC abused it. And recently we had a comparison like this. We talked about it with the Leave PGA. What they're accusing them of doing is that the PGA is merging with Leave, so they're not competing with each other anymore, right? And that's a violation of the Sherman Act. That's what the argument is. And this is what they're kind of claiming what the UFC did, is they're violating the Sherman Act by, not merging with a parallel promotion, but in this case, putting out a business and taking off the landscape potential rival promotions or other promotions that have top fighters or name value or whatever. So, and then it goes on and on about the matchmakers, how the matchmakers have tremendous power. Because I think I mentioned that earlier, because they get to pick who the fighter's opponent is, the placement on the card, whether they'll be on a pay-per-view or televised. So all that control over a fighter's career makes the fighters, it's just a tremendous amount of control over a fighter. It's not like being knowing ahead of time on your contract what your responsibility is going to be. It's basically you are at the whim of your promoter of how your career is going to go from this point on, and that gives them a lot of control. As we've seen, as we know, fighters won't, they won't talk about anything that pisses them off publicly. They won't say, because they're at risk that the UFC will not give them one of those bonuses or a better contract or a sponsorship.
That's one thing for those 4 fighters from the Utah card that actually allowed their pay to be disclosed. One of them was the lowest paid guy on the card, and that was Gabriel Bonfim. He only made 12 and 12, and he was brave enough to say, no, I want mine out there.
Yeah, no, but it's understandable. I mean, they spelled it out. I think they have a section they spelled out, because Zuffa fighters did not get paid unless they fought. And talking about Stephen Wonderboy Thompson, right?
Yeah.
This enabled Zuffa to use various strategies relating to the timing, placement, number, and opponents of a fighter's bout to coerce fighters into renewing their contract early or extending their contracts in order to earn a paycheck.
There's our real world, real time correlation right there. Stephen Thompson is a perfect example that's happening right now. Let's talk about wage share versus wage level.
Okay, let's. So wage share, this is one of the arguments in the case. And this is what makes this case kind of unique, because there's a lot in the antitrust world. There's a lot of attention on this case because, one, we don't get many monopsony cases. Those are rare to begin with. Two, wage share is even rarer. I mean, in some argument that we might never, this might be the only case that's used wage share. And the difference is wage level is we get an hourly rate at a work, right? Let's say someone's working somewhere and they're making $20 an hour. They go to they accuse them of using the power to lower their wages. And they're like, well, I should be making $23 an hour because the guy across the street's making $23. That's wage share. Wages that set at one level goes up. Wage level. Wage share is the percentage of the revenue they're making. And so the argument has been, since no one uses it, it's absurd to use that because people are paid on a relative, their wage level. No one really is paid on wage share. That's the argument the defendants have made. But the court has agreed with the plaintiffs that wage share is proper. One is because the fighters are the product, right? They're the product, and so the product has a portion of the revenue. In other words, if a rock band is at a stadium, you don't pay the rock band, here's your $500 for the night. Now we built the stadium, we're keeping everything. They're going to say, we want a piece of the action. And they point out, one is the closest comparison, boxing, wage share is used all the time to figure out the contracts, to talk about how the business is doing. And UFC, what also is damning to them is UFC in their own documents, that's how they measure their business. They talk repeatedly about how much of the money is going to the fighters, which percentage of this event went to the fighters, what percentage of that, about how low of the percentage can we keep it in the future. And so the court has decided, in this case, and this is something I'm sure they'll appeal, is that wage share is a proper use in this case, and this case could be cited in the future. If this holds up, doesn't get overturned on appeal, and continues forward, this case might be getting cited in the future.
Let's talk about the finding that the plaintiff can ask for injunctive relief.
Yeah, this is big, and this is something I think a lot of people are kind of ignoring. The defendants have asked that the plaintiffs should have no right to injunctive relief because there's no current fighters. In other words, what the fighters want now is not represented by the fighters in this lawsuit because the class period ends in 2017. The Johnson v. Zuffa lawsuit, the one that's ongoing starting in 2017 that we haven't gotten any progress on until now, that would probably be the one they're going to argue deserves to have talk about injunctive relief. But the judge said, no, that's not accurate, that it's because three of the fighters were active at the time the original suit was filed, that it's proper that they have injunctive relief. They're still eligible for injunctive relief. And what that means is the court can not only grant damages to the plaintiffs if they win, and damages are huge because people remember their experts estimate that the UFC owes them for the bout damages of $811 million to $1.6 billion. So that's a lot of money right there. And if it goes to trial and you win in trial in an antitrust lawsuit, the damages are trebled. In other words, tripled. So that $811 million becomes $2.433 billion to $4.8 billion.
What about court and attorney costs? Would that be
that gets added to? They can ask for that, and the judge can order, the jury can order that the plaintiffs pay for those jury and court costs too.
The plaintiffs or the defendants?
The defendants, if they lose, they can ask them to pay for the plaintiff's costs. So it could even be higher than that. But that's one thing. But the other thing is that's a ton of money, and that can be crippling to the UFC and Endeavor. But the business could continue after that point because they make so much money, right? They could come up with an installment payment plan, whatever. What's equally threatening to the UFC is this injunctive relief, because what that means, the judge could order them that they have to do certain things because the court has found that they've abused their monopoly power so much. And if the examples in the past suggest that it's pretty radical what the court could ask. There's a previous monopoly case involved in boxing called the International Boxing Club of New York, the United States versus the International Boxing Club of New York. And the International Boxing Club of New York was found to have abused market power, monopoly power in boxing. And so what the court ordered as a relief was you can no longer have exclusive contracts for the next 5 years. So every boxer under contract with you right now is no longer exclusive. They're still under contract with you, but they can go negotiate with any promoter they want and sign a bout with them if they get offered more money. And on top of that, for the next 5 years, you cannot sign to have an exclusive contract. So anybody you sign and make a new contract with can go, and if we applied that to the UFC, it'd be like, you're under contract with the UFC right now, but if you want, you can go over to talk to Bellator, PFL, whoever you want. And if you like their offer better, you can fight for them 1 or 2 fights, then come back and ask the UFC for your fight that you're under contract for. So that's one possibility, which would be game changing for this, right? Would destroy the UFC model. But the other one is what the plaintiffs have suggested in their previous filings, and that is they would like the court to order the UFC to have their contracts limited to just 1 to 2 years max. No extensions, no tolling provisions, nothing beyond that point. So as we've seen with Nate Diaz, who took 6 years to get out of his contract, and Francis Ngannou with 5 years, 1 or 2 years is pretty simple for especially stars to wait out, right? So you could have big name fighters fight once or twice, and then instead of finishing out their contract, say, I'm just going to wait the 1 year, 6 months, whatever. And then I can not only ask the UFC for more money to go somewhere else, but I know there's going to be several other big name fighters available to do the same thing. And so big fights now are potentially easy to move somewhere else. And so both those would just completely change the current landscape of MMA.
So what happens next?
Well, the next step is the UFC's going to obviously appeal this. They have, I think, 6 weeks to file an appeal with the Ninth Circuit. After that, there's a period of time the Ninth Circuit will get back to them. But as you people can probably tell, I'm not an attorney. I'm just a guy that reads a lot of this stuff. So anyways, but very shortly, within, sometime early next year, we will know if the Ninth Circuit is going to pick up this case or reject it. In other words, if the Zuffa is going to appeal the ruling, the class cert, by the end of the year, early next year, we should know if the Ninth Circuit says we are going to look at this case and maybe have to retrial certain things so we don't agree with the judge, or basically say, you know what, judge didn't do anything wrong, this moves on. In which case, We might have a summary judgment, probably won't. I think at that point, we're going to be moving towards an actual trial. If the Ninth Circuit turns it down, a trial is not too far after that. At that point, I imagine UFC would be calling them to settle, try to make a settlement, because as we talked about with the injunctive relief and the damages, the risk is just too massive to the company. At the same time, the plaintiffs, who are probably tired of this getting dragged out and don't want to be dragged out much longer, for years more, and there's also the risk you could lose in a trial, will accept something, but I'm not sure what. I'm sure they're going to be asking for enough to compensate them for the time and stuff. But again, that's down the road. But if the Ninth Circuit picks up the appeal, this could stretch on for a couple more years. And the appeal could just then at that point send it back to the judge and say, we found this wrong and you have to redo this portion. So losing the appeal and having the Ninth Circuit pick it up could be just devastating for the plaintiffs. Getting it rejected, the appeal, would be devastating for the defendants. So I guess that's where we're at right now.
So if you were to gauge how long it takes for this thing to shake out one way or the other, just from a casual eye, yours being a little more than casual, you've got a pretty educated eye. So put your eye on this and just give me a guesstimate, because you guesstimated the right month. Let's see if we can get it narrowed down a little more.
I mean, it's almost impossible because it all depends on what happens on the appeal, right? If the appeal goes through and they appeal it and the Ninth Circuit picks up the case and wants to look at it, then I'm guessing this is just going to add years to the case, right? But if the Ninth Circuit shoots it down, sends it back and says that was a fine decision, we're not picking up this case to look at that point, even then, I think within sometime next year we get a settlement. And on top, you got to remember, at that point, the UFC might have merged with WWE. Guess who's responsible for all those damages? What I've seen found in the SEC is that the UFC is responsible. So that means the new company with WWE would be responsible for those damages. The shareholders will be stuck with it. So I'm kind of imagining that if it goes that and it's going to go on to trial, they're going to want to settle, because that the valuation of that company is going to completely plummet if the UFC has to pay out billions of dollars in damages and their contracts are completely rewritten where they're only a year or two long max. So that would destroy the valuation of the UFC and probably that company, TKO's valuation as well. And so for that reason, I would imagine that if we get past the appeal process, settlement is the final result of the settlement. Now, for the UFC, of course, they hope it's picked up by appeal, and they want to drag this out as long as possible to the point to the fighters, the plaintiffs, and say we will settle for some peanut butter cups because it doesn't cost the UFC really anything to drag this out. The longer it goes, the cheaper it is for the UFC.
Let's say that the appeal doesn't go through and the UFC goes to settle. What happens to all this if they decide to settle? This just goes away?
It could. The UFC settlement, knowing that there's this massive trial case coming up that could just destroy the company, is probably going to settle for a lot. Maybe they won't settle for the billions, but hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of million, maybe up to $1 billion, just a massive amount of money. And on top of that, maybe they won't make the contracts 1 or 2 years, but they will probably offer something to the to the plaintiffs. So they agree, because guys like John Fitch have said that's very important to them. Injunctive relief, and the named plaintiffs have to agree to the settlement. And so the UFC might come back and say, we won't do 1 or 2 year contracts, but we'll do a 3-year contract max, or 4 year. We will have it that we can't extend the contracts if you turn it on fights this long. We will extend that. We really do have to offer you 3 fights a year. We do have to give you that or pay you. Okay. There could be all these things that they offer in part of the settlement to make the contracts much better, much more flexible. And would help fighters possibly, make more and also be able to test the market when they want it at an earlier date. So it could still be a big win, but not to the level where it's an existential threat to the UFC win.
So basically, we'll probably never see this thing go all the way through the court system, right?
I just find it hard to believe it will, because the UFC says they're gonna. Uh-huh. But when you get that far and you're talking about the result like that, there's a reason that when they get to trial, almost all these antitrust cases ended up in a settlement, because the risk is just so high. again, but the UFC, their thinking is they're going to appeal, and their goal is eventually to continue dragging out as long as possible.
I think that about wraps this up. What I want to do right now is ask you when the next installment is going to happen, because I know there's going to be more, and you've just got this 80-page document today. So we've talked about the major points of it, but I'm sure there'll be some other things uncovered when you finish reading the whole thing cover to cover. So what can we look forward to in the next episode?
Well, we can look for, I guess, we'll probably should always be apologizing to Boulware because we said he didn't write this. It was never going to come out. It did. So he shut all of us up. But I think the next one, I think there's going to be a status conference on August 21st, I believe, just 2 weeks from now.
Yep.
That's going to talk about where the case is going to progress. I think that after that, we get a sense of where the case is going to progress. We might get some more filings from the plaintiffs and the defendants. We might even get the appeal filing by the defendants. So that's a good time. I mean, shortly after that status conference, probably a good time to go over what we know and what's going to happen in this case.
Awesome. What I need you to do right now is go straight to bloodyelbow.com because John has a wonderful article over there basically explaining everything we talked about, but probably in a little more detail and probably a little more clear and concise on paper for you. So make sure you get over there and check that out. Make sure you're following John on Twitter. You get everything broke there really, really fast. He is at Hey, Not the Face. And you can also, if you have questions, DM him. His messages are open. So are mine. I'm Crooklyn949. If you have questions, send us a message. We love those. And do us a favor, subscribe to our Substack. We need all the help we can get so we can keep our family together. If you already subscribe, please just share. Let everyone know. John's doing really good work here. He's always out there getting the goods for us. So, let's reward him with some subscriptions. And y'all know the drill from here. Until next time, please stay safe.
Not in the face! Thank you.